She's also often the moral center of the episode, and whenever she does go off the rails, it ends with some gesture of familial or romantic love that brings her back to the loving wife and mother she typically is. Lois having completely departed from this characterization in modern Family Guy is another reality so well known that it's not worth me laboring. So let's move on to the final Griffin adult, Brian. What's interesting is that in season 1, Brian doesn't get an episode that treats him at all like a character until the finale. Instead, his initial role in the show is mostly being above the narrative and commenting on it from the sidelines. He's the closest thing to a self-insert from McFarlane, and therefore this role makes sense. However, after season 1, he plays a more active role in the plot and gets more spotlight episodes. He especially carries a lot of the more emotional scenes, and is written to be quite mentally complex. The biggest change to Brian's character as the show progressed was the idea he's actually a massive phony, but early on it's implied the way he presents himself is broadly accurate. Also, initially Brian and Stewie are shown to mostly hate each other, and they do throughout the early seasons, but we see them paired up often. In seasons 2 and 3, we get 2 Brian and Stewie Road to episodes. Brian and Stewie episodes are now sometimes thought of as being the best modern episodes, and the benefits of this pairing were clearly realized early on. Stewie's evil genius characterization starts off really intense. He canonically kills a guy in the 3rd episode of the show, and this was back before murderous violence was the punchline it later became. I mean, the guy was an evil cult member, but still, Stewie straight up executed him. If you actually look at some of the old Fox promos for Family Guy, they really lean into Stewie as a selling point.
America, prepare for Stewie.
Are you lost?
Now listen to me, Jolene. I've got an army to raise, and I must get to Nicaragua.
A bit like how The Simpsons originally started off with Bart Mania before Homer took the spotlight. Anyway, the big question with Stewie is how gay was he early on? And the answer is not very. They have a few hints at the idea he might be gay, but they also have loads and loads of moments of him being explicitly characterized as attracted to girls.
Do her, wouldn't do her. Ugh, who hasn't done her?
Honestly, I find his later shtick of being gay for Rupert really funny.
Don't frolic too much, Rupert. Save some energy for the hula contest.
The idea of an evil genius who tries to take over the world, but is also romantically involved with his own teddy bear because he's a gay baby? Come on, that's hilarious. And finally, let's talk about the last member of the Griffin family, Chris. Chris's characterization is actually really interesting in the early seasons. He's basically written to be an artistic nonconformist in most of his dialogue and storylines.
Way to go, Dad! Fight the machine!
However, he's also written to hugely admire his dad and seek out his attention and approval. He is, of course, an idiot. Possibly a bigger idiot than Peter. However, he's easily the sweetest member of the Griffin family, and Chris-centered episodes usually end up with Peter learning to appreciate his son. Overall, the early seasons have a pretty wholesome family dynamic.
Oh my god, we forgot Meg!
Alongside Joe, Meg is known for becoming a punching bag in the later seasons. Unlike Joe, however, Meg was never characterized especially favorably. As such, what made Meg different in the early seasons is slightly more subtle. One big difference is that the show was way more comfortable making her the main character. She's still regarded as unpopular and unattractive, but the show actually features stories about her struggle to make friends or connect with boys that she likes. And there are episodes where was actually accurate.
You don't know anything about me!
What was that guy?
That's my best explanation for how Meg came to quite immediately occupy this role as the show's punching bag. Nonetheless, Meg does have a few episodes early on where the story works out well for her, and significantly, this doesn't just function as a conspicuous subversion of her character. At the time, it wasn't impossible to imagine her actually coming out of an episode on top. Everyone talks about Flandersization, where characters become more one-dimensional and certain character traits get exaggerated over and above them being a more nuanced character. What's often ignored is the exact opposite occurring in long-running shows. If you've ever seen the Real Jim series, Simpsons Histories, you'll quickly discover that characters who made very little impact in the golden era of the show have had their backstory and personality massively expanded in later seasons. It makes sense, obviously. They're running out of ideas in the writer's room, so somebody says, let's just invent a whole new backstory for this minor character. To an extent, this has happened with Meg. You can't keep the show going forever while relegating one character to just being a loser, so they've actually given her way more to do in recent seasons. Possibly the best example of this reverse Flandersization is actually Quagmire. In the early seasons, he's very basic and almost all his jokes are about one specific thing. In later seasons, his pervertedness falls decidedly into the background in favor of a much broader characterization. This all might sound pretty good, and seeing characters evolve is a fun consequence of these shows going on so long. However, I think there's something to be said for keeping characters simple and well-defined. Most of the time, it's good for a show to know what it is. The early seasons had their own unique tone. Honestly, a surprisingly quaint tone. People often think of The Simpsons as the show with heart that's down to earth and kind of charming, in contrast to Family Guy, which is generally viewed as brutish and cynical. However, in the same year, Family Guy did episodes where Peter posed as a high school student to discourage kids from doing drugs, and Chris had to choose between pursuing his artistic ambitions or spending time with his father. The Simpsons was doing an episode where Homer gets ripped by a panda. You could argue Family Guy moved into a niche that The Simpsons once filled but had since vacated. By the time Family Guy came along, The Simpsons really wasn't a family sitcom with any semblance of traditional values. Family Guy in many ways rejuvenated the presentation of those values on TV after The Simpsons abandoned them. Honestly, in some ways the fundamental worldview of Family Guy is actually less bleak than The Simpsons, even in the earlier seasons of both shows. In season 1 of The Simpsons, Marge strongly considers cheating on Homer, while in early Family Guy, Lois never comes close to that. In season 1 of The Simpsons, they have episodes where Lisa has depression and Homer tries to take his own life. In season 2, Homer literally tells Lisa he doesn't care why she's sad.
Hey, just because I don't care doesn't mean I don't understand.
Peter never expresses any equivalent sentiment. I don't think this makes Family Guy better than The Simpsons, obviously. It's actually pretty cool how real The Simpsons gets with some of these dark subjects. However, people would generally expect Family Guy to be the darker of the two shows tonally, but it really isn't. I will say that Family Guy doesn't do emotional resolutions as well as The Simpsons did. In the aforementioned episode where Homer is awful to Lisa, there's a substantial, well-paced, well-scripted scene where Homer makes it up to her and provides some closure. By contrast, there's one episode of Family Guy where Peter completely neglects Chris by mentoring Cleveland Jr. Then Jr. abandons him, and Peter meets up with Chris and they just start playing golf together. There's no conversation, no real resolution. You could say it's understated, I'd call it underdeveloped. And I partially blame the cutaway format. Those cutaways take up a minute or two of every episode. A minute or two that could otherwise be dedicated to a scene that brings some of these plots to a more satisfying conclusion. Anyway, with all this talk of tone, I've kind of been implying Family Guy has no edge at all. It's generally thought of as an offensive show, but it's also worth remembering.
Why would you even say that? For shock value? Geez, Cleveland, there's edgy and there's offensive. Good day, sir.
There are offensive jokes on this show that you wouldn't see in a show like The Simpsons, but again, to the show's credit, it's not just being brazenly offensive for the sake of it. What really...
Papa disse, não é? Also, exato, não é? Alto. 大爆不吧不吧不吧
have a sort of elite status. But there's nothing crazy here. Oh my god, he moves! And while these sprites are really fun and lively, lots of them are far from perfect. Mew looks appropriately cute and playful, but whenever its tail moves, it just completely disintegrates. Well, it does look nicer on emulator, which is nicer in general, because this is not okay. Spiritomb's shape is pretty circular, and in this sprite, while the choppiness makes it look far more intense, the uneven spinning looks weird, and it looks like it's gonna fall over. The way these sprites work is that they're made up of a bunch of different parts. Oh god, and in way too many cases, the parts just don't connect properly. Mewtwo's right hand flat out breaks in half sometimes. There are quite a few stray pixels on Regigigas' leg, making it look like it has no foot. How's that for slow start? And looking way too closely at one of Dugtrio's frames, you can see that the middle body doesn't connect to anything. Unless that is the true body. Arbok's pretty funny because they just flat out forgot one of the stripes on his body. Hey, don't worry, I'd lose count too. We can also do... There we go, it's like nothing happened. But none of these stop the Unova games from feeling so alive in so many ways. Seeing Flaccid Unknown is weird, but it's not its charm. And come on, we all have to thank Gen 5 sprites for giving us Depressed Azurill. This is unparalleled.